I would like to speak a bit about the subject of male privilege throughout history. This is something that feminists often raise as one of their sort of key points in terms of inequality towards women. Now, when we talk about privilege and equality, we need to be clear what exactly we're referring to, and that covers an umbrella of different things. For instance, if you're talking about voting rights, land ownership, things like that, there's no question about it. Men have more rights than women in many societies throughout history. I mean, we can't deny that. It's just a fact. It wasn't until 1928 in this country that women got to vote in the same way as men. 10 years earlier, women over 30 could vote, but it wasn't until 1928, under the Baldwin administration, that all women could vote. That was way too long, so clearly it's an issue. In other countries, legislation was introduced slightly earlier, slightly later, different times. New Zealand, I believe, was the first country to introduce it in 1898, but don't quote me on that. I believe it was the first country. Anyway, so you would think that when we talk about privilege and rights throughout history, we're talking solely about issues connected with money and empowerment, issues like voting, which is an act of empowerment, land ownership, which is connected with individual independence, making choices, that sort of thing. And I think you would have to be honest and say that men have had, in that way, overall the upper hand throughout history. But there's one area I believe is massively overlooked by feminists, and that is war. Now, in the history of warfare, which goes back almost as long as human origins, war is ancient, and in all parts of the world, in all cultures, you can find examples of men dying by their thousands as part of a war, whether that be to defend a country, to invade a country, or under contexts such as defending a king, and in many cases defending women. This is something that feminists hugely overlook, and at times I believe they just outright trivialise it, which I think frankly is quite shameful. Now let's be clear about this. For the vast majority of those men, 95% of those men, there was absolutely no privilege involved. It was a case of either being pressured into it through nationalistic hysteria, as was the case in World War I and in the American Civil War, when you saw, in fact the film Gone with the Wind shows a good scene where all the young Confederates are sort of gathered together in Ashley's house. There's a sort of war hysteria, and they kind of shame Rhett Butler because they call him a coward and stuff because he questions the motivation. There's other examples that have been in film that have shown that, but they're accurate representations because this is what throughout history men have faced. So it's either been a case of being forced to fight legally, i.e. conscription, or being pressured into it through nationalistic hysteria, whereby okay, you might not be forced to fight legally, but you will endure shame, ridicule, humiliation. Even in many cases, I won't talk in detail about the white feather issue because I already covered that in another video, but that was the act in World War I of women handing men a white feather under the assumption that they weren't doing their duty. In many cases it was factually wrong anyway, because there were men who were home on leave, things like that. But even in the case of those who weren't fighting, maybe they were in reserved occupations like engineers or whatever, but whatever way you look at it, it was shameful, because the white feather campaign directly led many men to be killed, which in the case of World War I was probably the preferable option because so many men were horribly scarred for life. And it's conceivable that in many cases they were literally driven to that because of the shame of the white feather. and I think that's something that should never be forgotten. So when feminists talk about male privilege, I believe they hugely underestimate the unique pressure that is put on men at times of war. And it is unique because throughout history women have never been expected to go and fight. They've never been expected to sacrifice their lives. They were always the protected, not the protectors. And that is a very, very critical thing. Now, this is not that I'm saying the men shouldn't have necessarily performed that role. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying, for example, that, let's say for the sake of argument, there was an invasion of this country, a very powerful force invaded this country. Of course I would be protective of female friends. That's the way I am. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. But what I do question is the argument that men are in a privileged position for doing so. Now, what feminists will say is, oh, you can't blame feminism for this. Well, I'm not blaming feminism. And they would be right to say it would be a result of patriarchy. That is probably accurate. But what I do take issue with is that they propagandize this in a way that they just don't recognize that men are, throughout history, men have faced unique pressure in times of war. This is unquestionable. Throughout history, literally, millions of men have sacrificed, many of them for women. Because quite often war propaganda was, you had to, in the case of the First World War, there was the notorious rape of Belgium. Now, it may well be that atrocities were committed by the German forces, but no doubt the propagandists exaggerated the extent they dehumanized the Germans and made it look like these mad brutes attacking our women, attacking Belgian women, therefore they're going to attack British women next, this sort of thing. So it was relying on this old-fashioned notion of male chivalry, protection of women and so on, and that literally drove many men to their death. Now, I don't want to ignore the fact that in warfare there has also been civilian massacres, so a lot of this isn't unfounded in terms of the need to protect vulnerable people. And in war, women are seen as more vulnerable because they're physically weaker. The average woman is physically weaker than the average man, so they are seen as more vulnerable, just like children and elderly people. So that is understandable, but it just makes me think we should never ever forget the sacrifice those brave men made in many cases to defend women. Now, purists would say it should be entirely 50-50, men shouldn't defend their country and protect women, that sort of thing, but I don't want to so much go down that path. I want to more look at this claim of male privilege, because I actually think it insults those men who died in countless wars throughout the world to try and claim that throughout history men have been privileged. And it isn't just in warfare, there's other examples. I mean, if you look at in ancient Rome, the gladiators, in some cases we know they were slaves, which automatically takes away any notions of privilege, but in many cases actually those gladiators, there are examples where they were forced to become sex slaves to rich Roman women. So ask yourself, who really has the upper hand there? A gladiator who's a slave, who's forced to fight to death, forced to kill another gladiator, possibly his friend, forced to make love to a woman that he probably doesn't know, isn't attracted to. Now, where is the privilege there? Feminists will say, oh well, that's just one example, but like I say, warfare is not just one example. It can be found throughout history. It's not just World War I, as one feminist tried to say to me recently. She said, oh well, that's just one war, but that's just the point. It can be found throughout history, in every classical formation war. Now, the reason I say classical formation is because warfare today is very different. Warfare today tends to be characterized by indiscriminate terrorist attacks, by sniper attacks, by guerrilla warfare, street-to-street fighting. Classical formation battles, one nation state versus another, is almost unheard of in today's sort of warfare. Which, the style of warfare has changed in that sense. And in some parts of Africa, certainly women are overwhelmingly targeted. For example, in the Congo, we know about that rape is used as a weapon of war. And no doubt it's been used as a weapon of war in other conflicts throughout history. But what I do question is the way that feminists just ignore the fact that men had to face this unique choice of either risk your life, die, possibly die, or be branded a card, be stigmatized from the society that you live in. That is a choice throughout history that many men have had to make. So for feminists to talk about privilege, I think they're hugely overlooking that. And I do think it's insulting to men who died. The reality is, throughout history, there have been an elite group of predominantly men who were privileged. The vast majority of men and women weren't. Now, it's true men had the vote, women didn't, but women never had to go to war and defend the homeland. There may be some examples in history of female warriors, of Amazonians in the ancient world and so on, but it is dwarfed in comparison to the sacrifice men made traditionally in war. That's not a sexist statement, it's just a reality. I mean, in the case of the First World War, the vast majority of fatalities were men. That's unquestionable. Where there were large numbers of women fatalities, it tended to be in some of the notorious genocides in the Eastern Front, which I don't ignore. It was a serious and real issue. But if you look at the Western Front, I mean, I don't see bands of women being machine gunned to death on the Western Front. Let's just not pretend otherwise. So when feminists constantly go on about male privilege, I think they're ignoring this fact. They're only focusing on things like voting and land ownership. And by the way, most men didn't own land anyway. That was a privileged minority. But I think they are hugely undervaluing that. And I'm not trying to stir anything up. I'm not trying to create a gender battle here. No doubt women have sacrificed in other ways. But not in war, not in the same way. Women have never had that sort of pressure to fight in the way that men have. Now there have been reforms in recent years. For example, women, I think in the US military now, women can serve on the front line for the first time. There's mixed views on that from feminists, from a wide range of people. Some would say that women should not be on the front line. That isn't necessarily feminist. That's a lot of men say that. Others say they should be. If men are risking their lives, why shouldn't women, etc. So personally, I have mixed views on that. I haven't entirely decided about that one. However, if it does mean more equality, that's probably a good thing. I admit I feel uneasy about it. I'm not going to lie. I feel uneasy about it. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, whatever. It's not so much that I criticise the role men have played in war, although in many cases it was for the wrong reason. It was because of nationalistic, imperialistic reasons. But there's other times when war, I'm not a pacifist, I believe at times war is necessary. However, that is not the issue that bothers me. What bothers me is that feminists hugely undervalue the sacrifice of men. Now, I don't want to talk about all feminists. In World War I, there were socialist feminists who saw their brothers, their fathers and so on being killed, and they did have compassion, they did care, and that's why they were anti-war. So I give full respect to those feminists. But like I mentioned in the previous video, the feminist movement was divided. I guess from their perspective, they would have been called traitors if they opposed the war, so there is that issue. But what people who are critical of feminism need to understand is those feminists were actually doing it for men, because they didn't want to see young men being killed. So their actions at that time was for men. There was the other side, of course, Emmeline Pankhurst and her crowd. She's idolised by the feminist movement, but let's not forget, Emmeline Pankhurst was one of the leading advocates of war. And she was a leading advocate of the White Feather campaign. So Emmeline Pankhurst, frankly, had the blood of a lot of young men on her hands. You might say, well, she wasn't a politician. She didn't make the decisions. That's true, but she did act as, and feminists who followed her did act as a major recruiting tool. There's no question about that. Because they put aside the feminist objectives for those years, and instead they turned to basically turning young men into cannon fodder through their propaganda. Now, I'm not just focusing on them. Of course not, that would be ridiculous. It was government policies. All I'm saying is that when feminists talk about male privilege, they hugely overlook these things, and they hugely overlook the forced sacrifice men have had to make. Now, yes, it's true that a lot of that is a result of patriarchy, but so I'm not blaming the feminist movement, although I think Emmeline Pankhurst and co contributed to it. But I guess I'm not structuring this very well. What I'm trying to say is that it's just disingenuous to try and say that throughout history men have had being like princes. The way feminists talk, you would think that throughout history men have been privileged princes living in their ivory towers. I think that's an insult to the countless examples of men who have been basically used by the state, used by militaries, as human sacrifice, in many cases to protect women. This is just a fact. And no doubt many women throughout history, if the man didn't do that, they would have saw him as less of a man. This is indisputable. Now, it may well be that it was patriarchy that caused that attitude and that system, but when feminists talk about privilege, I think they should really acknowledge the many times in the history of warfare when men were forced to do things that women would never have been forced to do. You can't deny that. So where is the privilege there? Really, where is the privilege for men forced to fight in war? There is no privilege. None.